3 months had passed since that first impossible moment, when Sophie had commanded a warbeast to sit, and the universe had changed in ways both obvious and subtle, and Lucas stood on the observation deck of a new facility built on a moon orbiting the neutral world of Epsilon Prime, and below him he could see the training grounds where humans and warbeasts were learning to understand each other. The facility was enormous, and it had to be to house 50 warbeasts and the 100 human handlers who had volunteered for this experimental program. And Earth had sent its best and animal trainers and veterinarians and behaviorists and people who had spent their lives working with dangerous creatures and trying to understand the minds of beings that could not speak but could still communicate. Katie stood beside him, and she held a datapad as always, and her role had shifted from military officer to program coordinator, and she managed schedules and tracked progress, and compiled reports that went to both Earth and the Krethian Council. "How many successful bondings so far?" and Lucas asked. 42, and Katie replied, and out of 50 warbeasts and 42 have bonded with human handlers, and 8 remain resistant, but even those 8 are showing less aggression than they did when they arrived. "That is better than I hoped," and Lucas admitted. "The key was finding the right people," and Katie explained, "and not everyone can do what Sophie does, and it requires a specific personality type and someone who has genuine empathy for animals and who can look at a creature designed for killing and see a being that deserves kindness." Lucas looked at the training ground, and he could see a woman named Betty Hayes working with a warbeast called Nixtal. And Betty was in her 50s and had spent 30 years training rescue dogs on Earth, and she moved around the massive creature with confidence and without fear, and Nixtal watched her with the same devoted attention that Vexthor showed Sophie. The handlers had learned that each warbeast was different, and some responded best to firm commands while others needed gentler guidance, and some wanted physical affection, while others preferred to maintain distance, and it was not a simple process, and it required patience and understanding and a willingness to fail and try again. Claire Bennett had joined the program, and she had decided that if her daughter was going to be part of galactic history, then she would be there too, and she had proven to be a natural handler, and 3 warbeasts had bonded with her, and she worked primarily with the most damaged ones and the ones that had been through the worst training, and that carried the deepest scars. Sophie herself had become something of a legend, and the Krethians called her the first friend, and some of them had begun to treat her with reverence that made Lucas uncomfortable, but Sophie remained completely unaware of her importance, and she just wanted to play with the big puppies and tell them stories and make sure they were happy. Vexthor had never left her side, and the warbeast had been officially released from military service and bonded permanently to Sophie as her companion and protector. And where Sophie went, Vexthor followed, and the massive creature had proven surprisingly gentle in everyday life, and it played carefully with the child and slept outside her door at night, and watched over her with absolute dedication. A message appeared on Katie's datapad, and she read it quickly, and her expression grew serious. "And we have visitors." And she said, "And a delegation from the Krethian Council, and including members of the faction that opposes this program." Lucas felt his stomach tighten. "And are they here to shut us down?" "Us? I do not know," and Katie said, but Corval sent a warning, and he said they are looking for any excuse to declare the program a failure, and we need to be careful." The delegation arrived an hour later, and there were 5 Krethians, and led by a tall male whose scales were almost black and whose name was Zormak, and he was a general in the Krethian military, and he commanded 3 battle fleets, and he had built his career on the effective use of warbeasts in combat. General Zormak and Lucas greeted him formally and welcome to our facility, and we are honored by your visit. Zormak looked around the training ground with cold golden eyes. "And I am here to evaluate your progress." And he said, "And the council requires an independent assessment before making final decisions about the future of this program." "Of course," and Lucas said, "and we are happy to show you everything we have accomplished." They began a tour of the facility, and Lucas showed them the living quarters where the warbeasts slept, and the training grounds where handlers worked with their bonded partners, and the medical center where veterinarians treated injuries and illnesses, and where scientists studied the neurochemistry of bonding. Zormak remained silent throughout, and his expression gave away nothing, and his fellow delegates took notes and recorded video and asked occasional questions. Then they reached the main training ground where Sophie was working with Vexthor, and the child was teaching the warbeast to retrieve objects, and she would throw her toy spaceship, and Vexthor would carefully pick it up in his massive jaws and bring it back to her, and his movements were controlled and precise and nothing like the violent creature that had climbed the stairs toward her 3 months ago. "This is the child," and Zormak said, "and this is the one who began all of this." "Yes," and Lucas confirmed, "and this is Sophie Bennett, and she was the first human to successfully bond with a warbeast. And she is how old?" 4.5, and Lucas replied. Zormak watched Sophie play, and his expression remained neutral. "And bring me a warbeast that has not bonded," and he commanded, "and I wish to see a demonstration." Lucas felt uneasy, but he nodded, and Katie went to arrange it. And 20 minutes later, handlers brought out one of the 8 warbeasts that had resisted bonding, and this one was called Grathvor, and it was massive even by warbeast standards, and its body was covered in scars, and its eyes held nothing but hostility and aggression. "This creature has been in your program for 3 months," and Zormak observed, "and yet it has not bonded. And why is that?" "Some warbeasts are more damaged than others," and Lucas explained, "and Grathvor went through particularly brutal training, and it does not trust easily, but we are making progress." "Show me," and Zormak demanded. Lucas called over Martin Cole and one of their best handlers and a man who had worked with wild wolves in Alaska before joining the program, and Martin approached Grathvor slowly and spoke in a calm voice, and he tried to establish the connection that had worked with so many other warbeasts. Grathvor snarled and showed its teeth, and its tail lashed dangerously. Martin tried different approaches, and he offered food, and he used gentle commands, and he attempted the same techniques that had succeeded with other resistant warbeasts, but Grathvor refused all of it, and the creature remained hostile and untrusting. After 20 minutes, Martin stepped back, and his face showed frustration. "And I am sorry, sir," and he said to Lucas, "and Grathvor is not ready yet, and it needs more time." Zormak nodded slowly, and as I suspected, and he said, "And your program works only with warbeasts that are already inclined toward bonding, and the truly dangerous ones and the ones we actually use in combat remain beyond your reach." "That is not entirely accurate," and Katie protested, "and we have successfully bonded with several warbeasts that had extensive combat experience." "But not this one," and Zormak countered, "and not the most resistant, and not the most dangerous, and your program is built on the foundation of one child's unique gift, and it cannot be reliably replicated." Sophie had been watching all of this, and she walked over to where the adult stood, and her small hand slipped into Lucas's, and, "Can I try?" and she asked quietly. "And can I try with the sad puppy?" Lucas looked down at her and Sophie, and he said gently, "And Grathvor is very dangerous, and it is not like Vexthor, and it might hurt you." Sophie looked at Grathvor, and her expression was thoughtful, and he is not mean. And she said with that absolute certainty that children have, and he is just scared and lonely, and he needs a friend. Before Lucas could stop her, Sophie walked toward Grathvor, and Vexthor immediately moved to follow, but Sophie held up her hand, and "Stay, Vex," and she commanded, "And I am okay." Vexthor whined but obeyed, and the massive warbeast sat and watched his friend approach the dangerous stranger. Sophie stood in front of Grathvor, and the size difference was almost comical, and the warbeast towered over the tiny child and could have killed her with one movement and one bite and one swipe of its clawed foot. Grathvor growled, and the sound was deep and threatening, and Lucas reached for his weapon, and security forces moved closer, and everyone prepared for the worst. But Sophie did not run, and did not show fear, and she looked up at the massive creature, and spoke in her clear child's voice. "You are scared?" And she said, "And I know you are scared, and people hurt you, and they made you do bad things, and they were mean to you. But I am not mean, and I want to be your friend." Grathvor's growl faltered. Sophie continued speaking, and her voice was gentle and kind, "And you do not have to be scared anymore." And she said, "And nobody here will hurt you, and we just want you to be happy. And you can be happy if you let us be your friends." She raised her hand slowly in the same gesture she had used with Vexthor 3 months ago. "And sit." And she said softly, "And please sit, and let me help you." For a long moment nothing happened, and Grathvor stared at the child with its 6 eyes, and the entire training ground held its breath. 3 days had passed since Sophie had spoken that single word, and the entire station had been transformed into a research facility. And Lucas found himself watching video feeds more than sleeping, and the images showed Sophie playing with Vexthor in a large observation chamber, and scientists from 6 different species watched from behind protective barriers and took notes and ran scans, and tried to understand something that defied all their previous knowledge. Katie entered his quarters without knocking, and she carried 2 cups of coffee and a data pad, and her eyes were red from lack of sleep, and everyone on the command team had been working non-stop, and Lucas looked up from his screen and accepted the coffee gratefully. "You need to see this," and Katie said, and she pulled up a video on her data pad, and the image showed Sophie in the testing chamber. But this time, there were 4 warbeasts, and including Vexthor, and the other 3 had been brought from the Krethian fleet, and they were all larger and meaner looking than Vexthor, and their bodies bore scars from countless battles. Lucas watched as Sophie walked up to the nearest warbeast, and the creature was called Thaxmor, according to the data, and it had killed 23 beings in its career, and it was considered one of the most dangerous warbeasts in the Krethian military. "Sit," and Sophie said, and she pointed at the floor with that same confident gesture. Thaxmor sat immediately, and its massive body settling onto the floor, and its 6 eyes focused entirely on the small human child. Sophie moved to the second warbeast, and Corthax, and it had been involved in planetary assaults and had a reputation for being completely uncontrollable during combat. "Sit," and Sophie commanded. Corthax sat without hesitation. The third warbeast was called Venrak, and it tried to growl at Sophie, and the sound made even the scientists behind their barriers step back, but Sophie simply put her hands on her hips, and a gesture she had clearly learned from her mother, and she spoke more firmly. "Sit," and she said, and her voice held that absolute certainty that only a child could have. Venrak sat, and the growl died in its throat. Katie paused the video, and "It is not just Vexthor," and she said, "And every warbeast they have tested responds to her, and they obey instantly and completely, and it is not just the word sit either. And she can tell them to stay and to come and to lie down, and they do whatever she asks." Why, only her and Lucas asked, and they tried other humans, and didn't they? They did, and Katie confirmed, and they brought in 12 other human volunteers, and including adults and children and male and female, and none of them got the same response. And the warbeast ignored them or showed aggression, and only Sophie can command them. "There must be something different about her," and Lucas said, "and something unique." Liravel thinks she has an answer, and Katie said, "And the Krethian scientist has been studying Sophie's background and her psychological profile and everything about how she grew up." "And what did she find?" "Sophie grew up on a farming colony called New Montana," and Katie explained, "and her family raises livestock, and they have dogs and cats and horses and even some of those new genetic cattle that were developed for off-world environments, and Sophie has been around animals her entire life, and she has no fear of them, and more importantly, she has an instinctive understanding of animal behavior. So she treats the warbeasts like pets," and Lucas said, "More than that." And Katie replied, "And when Sophie tells Vexthor to sit, she is not commanding him as if she is superior, and she is not dominating him or threatening him, and she is communicating with him the way pack animals communicate with each other, and she sees herself as part of his pack, and maybe even as the pack leader, and the warbeast responds to that. The Krethians dominate their warbeasts," and Lucas said slowly, "an understanding beginning to form, and they break them and force them to submit. But Sophie befriends them, and she invites them to be part of her family." "Exactly," and Katie confirmed, and that is why it only works for her. And other humans do not have that same combination of fearlessness and genuine affection and instinctive understanding of pack dynamics. "What are the political implications?" and Lucas asked. Katie pulled up another document, and the Krethian Council has been in emergency session for all 3 days, and she said, "And they are divided, and roughly half of them want to eliminate the threat immediately, and they argue that humans could weaponize this ability and could turn the warbeasts against the Krethians and could destroy the foundation of their military power. And the other half? They see an opportunity," and Katie said, "and they recognize that what they have been doing to the warbeasts is cruel and unsustainable, and they want to explore whether humans can help them develop a better relationship with the creatures they created. Someone is going to try to kill Sophie," and Lucas said flatly, "and if half the Krethian Council sees her as a threat, then assassins are probably already on their way." Corval has anticipated that, and Katie assured him, and he has assigned 20 of his personal guards to watch over Sophie and Claire, and Vexthor refuses to leave Sophie's side, and anyone who tries to hurt that child will have to fight through a bonded warbeast first, and there is no documented case of anyone surviving. Such an encounter. A chime sounded at the door, and Lucas called for entry. And Corval himself entered, and the old Crethian looked even more tired than the humans, and his scales had lost some of their luster, and his golden eyes were heavy. "We need to talk about the future," and Corval said without preamble, "and I have a proposal from a faction of the Crethian Council, and the faction that believes in cooperation rather than elimination." Lucas gestured to a chair, and Corval sat, and his tail curled around his feet in that posture of distress that Lucas had learned to recognize. "What is the proposal?" And Lucas asked. "A joint program between our species," and Corval said, "and the Crethian. Empire will provide warbeasts, and humanity will provide handlers trained in your methods of animal bonding. And together we will attempt to rehabilitate these creatures and to undo some of the damage we have caused over the millennia. And in exchange," and Lucas prompted, "we formally recognize humanity as equals in the galactic community." And Corval replied, "And we sponsor your admission to the High Council, and we provide you with full access to our technology archives, and we acknowledge that humans have something to teach us about compassion and about the proper treatment of living beings." Katie looked skeptical, and that seems too generous, and she said, "And what is the catch?" "The catch is that this must succeed." And Corval said bluntly, "And if the program fails, and if humans cannot bond with other warbeasts the way Sophie has, then the faction that favors elimination will gain power, and they will argue that Sophie is a unique anomaly, and that the only safe course is to remove the threat permanently." "You are asking us to save your warbeasts," and Lucas said, and in doing so to save ourselves from being destroyed by your council." "Yes," and Corval admitted, "and I will not pretend otherwise, and this is a gamble for both our species but I believe it is a gamble worth taking." Lucas thought about Sophie in that testing chamber, and about the way 4 of the most dangerous warbeasts in the galaxy had sat at her command, and about the way Vexthor followed her everywhere, and protected her, and treated her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a creature. "How long do we have to make this work?" and Lucas asked. 6 months, and Corval said, "and the Council has agreed to a 6-month trial period, and we will bring 50 warbeasts to a neutral facility, and you will bring human handlers, and we will see if the bonding process can be replicated, and if these creatures can be rehabilitated, and if it fails," and Katie asked, "then both our species prepare for war," and Corval said quietly, "and because the faction that opposes this will not accept failure, and they will demand action, and the Crethian Empire does not lose often, and does not forgive threats easily. We need to contact Earth," and Lucas said, "and this decision is above my authority, and this requires approval from the highest levels of government." "I understand," and Corval agreed, "and I will wait for your response, but please understand that time is critical, and every day we delay is a day the opposition gains strength." After the Crethian left, and Katie looked at Lucas, and "Do you think we can do this?" and she asked, "And do you think other humans can bond with warbeasts the way Sophie has?" "I do not know," and Lucas admitted, "but I know we have to try, and because the alternative is unthinkable." He pulled up his communication console and began composing a message to Earth, and he tried to explain everything that had happened, and everything they had learned, and everything that was at stake, and then he tried to convey the weight of this moment and the understanding that a 4-year-old girl had accidentally changed the course of galactic history. The message would take hours to reach Earth, and the response would take hours more, and in the meantime Sophie continued to play with Vexthor and continued to demonstrate an ability that might save both species or doom them both. Lucas watched. The video feeds again, and he saw Sophie laughing as Vexthor gently batted her toy spaceship back to her, and he saw the way the massive creature moved with such care around the child and such devotion, and he found himself believing that maybe this could work. And maybe humanity really did have something unique to offer, and maybe the galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the greatest. Ambassador Corval stood slowly, and his movements were careful and deliberate, and his golden eyes were wide with an emotion that Lucas could not quite identify, and it might have been shock or fear or awe, or perhaps all 3 at once, and the old Crethian moved toward the gallery stairs, and his entire delegation followed him, and they walked like people approaching something sacred. "This is impossible," and Corval whispered, and his voice carried in the silent hall, "and in 10,000 years of Crethian history, this has never happened, and warbeasts do not bond, and they do not submit willingly, and they only obey through force and fear and pain. Sophie was now sitting on the floor beside Vexthor, and she had her toy spaceship in her hands, and she was telling the beast a story about how she and her mommy had traveled through space, and how they had seen so many stars, and the Warbeast listened, with all 6 eyes focused on her, and its head tilted slightly as if it understood every word. "Explain this," and Lucas said, and his commander voice was firm despite the confusion he felt, "and tell me what just happened, and why that creature obeyed a child it had never met before." Corval reached the gallery level, and he stopped a safe distance away, and the other Krethians fanned out behind him, and one of them was a female scientist whose name was Lyraval, and she carried scanning equipment, and she was taking readings of both the child and the Warbeast. Warbeasts are created through centuries of genetic engineering, and Corval began, and we take the genetic material of the most aggressive predators from our homeworld, and we combine it and modify it and enhance it, and we create something that should not exist in nature and something designed purely for war and for killing. He paused and watched Sophie pat Vexthor's massive head. And the training process is brutal, and it takes years, and many handlers die during the process, and we break the beast's will, and we reshape their instincts, and we force them to obey through pain and through fear and through starvation and through every method we have developed over millennia. Katie had lowered her weapon, but she kept it ready, and so they are slaves, and she said quietly, "And you torture them into obedience." Corval's scales seemed to darken, and yes, and he admitted, and we enslave them, and we make them into weapons, and they obey because they have no choice and because resistance brings only suffering. But they never truly submit, and they never bond with their handlers, and they tolerate us at best and hate us at worst. "Then why did it obey?" Sophie and Lucas asked, and she just said one word. And the beast sat immediately, and there was no hesitation and no resistance. Lyraval stepped forward, and her scanning equipment beeped softly, and I am reading neurochemical changes in Vexthor's brain, and she said, "And the patterns are unlike anything in our records, and the aggression centers are quiet, and the social bonding areas are active, and areas that we thought had been bred out of the species entirely." Sophie's mother, Claire, had finally reached her daughter, and she knelt beside the girl and tried to pull her away gently. But Sophie wrapped her arms around Vexthor's neck or at least as far around as her small arms would reach, and "No, Mommy," she protested, "and he is my friend, and I want to stay with him." Vexthor made that purring sound again and very gently pressed its head against Sophie's side, and the movement was careful and controlled, and the beast was clearly making sure not to hurt the child with its size and strength. "Look at its defensive posture," and Thunkar said, and wonder filled his voice. "And the beast is protecting the child, and it has adopted pack behavior, and it considers her part of its family unit." Zekral shook his head slowly, and we were told such behavior was impossible, and we were told that war beasts had no capacity for pack bonding, and that the genetic modifications had removed those instincts, but clearly we were wrong. "There are old stories," and Lyraval said softly, "and legends from before our civilization began genetic engineering, and stories of the wild ancestors of war beasts and creatures that lived in our forests before we conquered our world, and they say these ancient beasts could be tamed and could choose companions and would protect those companions with their lives, but we dismiss these as myths and as primitive superstition. Maybe the capacity was never truly removed," and Lucas said, "and maybe it was just buried and hidden and waiting for the right trigger and the right situation. And apparently humans are that trigger," and Katie added, or at least this human is." Sophie was now showing Vexthor her toy spaceship, and "Look," she said, "and this is my ship, and it goes really fast, and zoom zoom." And she made the toy fly through the air, and the Warbeast's eyes followed the movement, and when she brought it close to the beast's face, Vexthor very gently touched it with one claw. Claire looked at Lucas with desperate eyes, and "Please tell me my daughter is safe, and please tell me that thing will not hurt her." And her voice shook, and Lucas could see she was barely holding herself together. "I think she is safer right now than any of us," and Lucas said honestly, "and that war beast has bonded to your daughter, and it will protect her with its life. And the question is, what happens next?" Corval had been watching the interaction closely, and "We must study this," and he said, "and we must understand what has happened here, and this changes everything. We thought we knew about war beasts and about their nature, and about what we have done to them. You want to experiment on my daughter?" and Claire said sharply, and her maternal instincts overriding her fear, "and absolutely not. And we are leaving this station as soon as our ship is repaired." Not experiments, and Korval said quickly, and observations. Only, and we need to understand why Sophie can command Vexthor, and whether other humans have this ability, and whether this is specific to your daughter or common to your species. Lucas made a decision, and we will cooperate with reasonable observation, but Sophie and Claire will be under human protection at all times, and they will have quarters on our ship, and any testing will be voluntary and can be stopped at any time. Claire looked at him with gratitude. And thank you, she whispered. Katie was thinking ahead, and if other humans can do this, and she said slowly, and if we can bond with warbeasts the way Sophie has, and then the entire military balance in this sector changes and the Crethians' greatest weapon becomes neutralized and or worse becomes ours. Lucas saw Korval's expression shift, and the ambassador understood the implications immediately. And yes, and he said carefully, and some among my people will see this as a threat, and they will argue that humanity must be eliminated before you can exploit this ability. Are you threatening us? And Lucas asked, and his hand moved toward his weapon. No, and Korval said, and I am warning you, and I am one voice among many in the Crethian Council, and there are those who will advocate for preemptive action, and who will see Sophie not as a miracle but as an existential danger to our empire. Then we have a problem, and Katie said, or an opportunity, and Korval replied, and if we handle this correctly, and if we can demonstrate that this bonding ability benefits both our species, and then perhaps we can build something new and something better than the relationship we have had before. Sophie had stood up, and she took her mother's hand. And can we keep him? And she asked hopefully. And can the big puppy come home with us? And please, Mommy. Please. Claire looked helplessly at Lucas. And what do I even say to that? Vexthor rose to its feet, and the movement was fluid and graceful, and the beast positioned itself between Sophie and the crowd of aliens and diplomats, and its body language was clear, and it was protecting the child, and anyone who wanted to reach Sophie would have to go through the Warbeast first. We should move this to a more private location, and Lucas said, and we need to discuss what happens next, and we need to figure out security arrangements, and we need to contact both Earth government and the Crethian High Council. Agreed, and Korval said, and I will assign my personal guard to watch over Sophie and Claire, and if there are those among my people who wish harm to come to the child, they will have to face not only your security forces but mine as well. Why would you protect them? And Katie asked suspiciously. And you just said some Crethians will see this as a threat. Because I am old, and Korval said, and because I have lived long enough to recognize when the universe offers a chance for change, and for growth, and because I watched a 4-year-old child do something impossible, and in that moment I realized that everything we have built our empire upon might be a lie. He looked at Vexthor, and at the way the beast stayed close to Sophie, and the way it watched her with what could only be called devotion. We have spent 10,000 years believing that strength comes from domination, and that power comes from breaking the will of others, and we have tortured and enslaved these magnificent creatures and told ourselves it was necessary, and that they were just weapons and just tools. But that child spoke one word, and the most dangerous war beast in our fleet obeyed instantly, and not because it was forced to, and not because it feared punishment, but because it wanted to, and because in that moment it found something it had been searching for its entire life. What was it searching for? And Lucas asked. A pack, and Korval said simply, and a family, and someone who would treat it with kindness instead of cruelty, and someone who would see it not as a weapon but as a living being worthy of respect and affection. The grand hall was the largest room on the station, and it had walls made of transparent material that showed the planet below and the stars beyond, and representatives from 12 different alien species sat in tiered seating around the main floor, but everyone was focused on two groups, and the humans on one side and the Crethians on the other. And the air was thick with tension, and with the weight of history being made. Lucas sat at the negotiation table with Katie beside him, and 3 other members of his team. And across from them sat the Crethian ambassador, whose name was Korval. And he was old for his species, and his scales had faded to a pale green, and his golden eyes held centuries of experience and wisdom. And next to him sat his advisors, and they all wore robes marked with symbols of rank and status. And on the floor beside the Crethian delegation lay Vexthor, and the warbeast was stretched out like a cat, but a cat the size of a small vehicle, and its 6 eyes were half closed. But Lucas knew it was not sleeping, and it was watching everything, and waiting. And its two handlers stood nearby, and their names were Zekril and Thunkar, and they held neural prods ready, but they looked more nervous than confident. The first 2 days of negotiations had gone well enough, and the Crethians wanted access to 3 human agricultural worlds, and they offered shield technology that could protect ships from energy weapons, and it was a fair trade on the surface. But Lucas knew they were testing humanity, and seeing how far they could push and seeing if humans would give in to intimidation. Lucas had stood firm, and he had countered their demands with his own, and he had asked for medical technology in addition to the shields, and he had refused to give access to more than 2 worlds, and the Crethians had seemed surprised and perhaps even impressed, and the negotiations had continued. Now on the 3rd day, Lucas was presenting the final human offer, and he stood and spoke clearly, and his voice carried through the hall, and he outlined the terms and the conditions and the timeline for implementation, and he tried not to look at Vexthor tried not to think about those 6 eyes watching him. But then something happened that no one had planned for and no one had expected, and a sound came from the upper gallery, and a sound of small footsteps, and people began to gasp and point, and Lucas looked up and felt his heart stop in his chest. A little girl stood at the gallery railing, and she was looking down at all the aliens and diplomats with wide, curious eyes, and she could not have been more than 4 years old, and she wore a bright yellow dress that seemed too cheerful for this serious place, and her hair was brown and pulled back in a ponytail, and she smiled as she looked around, and she had no idea of the danger she was in. How did a child get in here? And Katie whispered, and her hand moved toward her weapon, and security was supposed to keep civilians away from the diplomatic area, and especially away from the Grand Hall, but somehow this little girl had found her way inside. Vexthor had seen her, and the Warbeast rose to its feet in one smooth motion, and all 6 eyes locked onto the child, and a low rumble came from deep in its chest, and the sound made every being in the room freeze, and it was the sound a predator makes when it sees prey, and when it decides to hunt. Nobody move, and Zekril shouted, and his voice was tight with fear, and any sudden movement will trigger its hunting instinct, and if you run it will chase, and if you attack it will kill. The little girl did not understand the danger, and she waved at the big creature and smiled and hello. She called out, and her voice was sweet and innocent and completely unafraid. Vexthor began to move toward the stairs that led up to the gallery, and its claws clicked on the floor and its tail swayed behind it, and every step was deliberate and focused, and the beast had entered hunting mode, and nothing could stop it now. Security personnel reached for their weapons, but Lucas threw up his hand and do not shoot. He commanded, and you will only make it angry, and plasma fire will not stop it fast enough, and the child will die. The Crethian handlers activated their neural prods, and they sent pulses of energy toward Vexthor's collar, and the beast flinched and shook its head, but it did not stop, and it was too far away and too focused on the child, and the collar's control had limits, and those limits had just been reached. The child is lost, and Korval said, and his voice held something that might have been sadness, and Vexthor has locked onto prey, and once a warbeast begins a hunt, nothing can break its focus, and even we cannot control it at this point. Where is her mother? And Lucas demanded. And where did she come from? And Katie was already pulling up information on her datapad, and a civilian transport docked for repairs. And she said quickly, and there was a botanist named Claire Bennett traveling with her daughter, and they were supposed to stay in the civilian section. Sophie and a woman's scream echoed through the Grand Hall, and Sophie, baby, where are you? And Claire Bennett burst through the entrance, and she was human, and in her 30s, and her face was white with terror, and she saw her daughter at the gallery, railing, and she saw Vexthor climbing the stairs, and she understood immediately what was about to happen. Lucas was already running, and Katie and a dozen security guards ran with him, but they were too far away, and the beast was too fast, and they would never reach the child in time, and Vexthor was already at the top of the stairs, and already on the gallery level, and already moving toward the little girl who had no idea she was about to die. Sophie watched the massive creature approach, and she showed no fear at all, and only curiosity and the innocent wonder of a child who had grown up around animals, and who had pets at home, and who had never learned that some creatures were dangerous. The beast was now only 20 feet away, and then 15, and then 10, and it lowered its huge head and brought one of its 6 eyes level with the child, and its mouth opened slightly, and Lucas could see rows of teeth designed to tear through armor, and through bone, and through anything that got in its way. Claire was screaming and trying to run, but security held her back, and they could not let her get close to the Warbeast, and she would only die along with her daughter. And Lucas felt sick and helpless, and he had failed to protect a child, and failed in the most basic duty any being had. But Sophie did something unexpected and something that would change everything, and she tilted her head and looked at the beast with the same expression she might give a large dog, and she raised one small hand and pointed at the floor with complete confidence. "Sit," and she said, and the word was clear and simple and spoken with the absolute authority of a child who expected to be obeyed. And Vexthor sat, and the massive Warbeast simply folded its legs beneath itself and sat on the gallery floor like an obedient pet, and the creature that had killed 17 beings and that had defied neural prods and override commands, and that had been designed to be unstoppable, just sat down because a 4-year-old girl had told it to. The silence in the grand hall was complete and total, and no one moved and no one breathed, and everyone stared at the impossible scene before them, and a little girl in a yellow dress standing next to a sitting Warbeast. Sophie smiled and walked forward, and her small hand reached out and she patted the beast's armored snout. "And good boy," she said, and Vexthor's 6 eyes tracked her movement, but the creature remained perfectly still. And when her hand touched its scales, the beast made a sound that no one in that room had ever heard from a Warbeast before, and it was a soft rumble that sounded almost like a purr. Lucas reached the gallery, but he stopped several feet away, and he did not want to startle the child or the beast, and Katie stood beside him with her weapon drawn, but it was clear that firing now would be more dangerous than helpful, and the moment was balanced on a knife's edge. Claire pushed past the last security guard and rushed toward her daughter and Sophie. "Baby, come here right now and come to Mommy," and her voice shook with fear and relief and desperate hope. "Mommy, look," and Sophie said happily, "and big puppy." And she scratched behind what might have been the beast's ear ridge, and her small fingers ran along the grooves in its armor plating, and Vexthor leaned into her touch, and its massive tail swayed gently back and forth. "That is not a puppy," and Claire said, "and sweetheart, please come here and please come to Mommy right now," and she held out her arms and tried to keep her voice calm, even though she was shaking all over. The Krathian handlers stood frozen, and their neural prods hung useless in their hands, and Zekral's mouth was open in shock, and Thunkar looked like he might faint. And they had trained Warbeasts for decades, and they had never seen anything like this. The trading station floated in the darkness of space like a small metal moon, and it had been there for almost 50 years now, and Commander Lucas Grant stood by the large window watching the stars. But his mind was not on the beauty of space, because something terrible was coming and he knew it, and his hands were pressed against the cold glass as he stared at the empty docking bay below and waited for the arrival that everyone feared, and the station had hosted many alien species over the decades, but nothing like what was coming today. And Lucas felt a cold weight in his stomach that would not go away no matter how much he tried to calm himself. Lieutenant Katie Morgan walked into the observation room, and her footsteps echoed on the metal floor, and she carried a data pad in her hands, and her face looked worried, and Lucas knew what she was going to say before she even opened her mouth, and he turned away from the window to face her, and she stopped a few feet away from him and took a deep breath before speaking, and her voice was quiet but clear in the empty room. "They are bringing the Warbeast," and Katie said the words slowly, and Lucas felt his jaw tighten. And he had read all the reports about these creatures, and he had seen the videos and the images, and nothing could prepare anyone for what a Krathian Warbeast really was. And these things were not just animals, and they were not just weapons, and they were something else entirely, and something that made even the bravest soldiers feel fear deep in their bones. The Krathians had been traveling through space for 10,000 years, and they had built an empire that stretched across hundreds of star systems. And they were reptilian beings with gray and green scales and golden eyes that seemed to see everything, and they were tall and strong, and their technology was far beyond what humans had. But their greatest weapon was not their ships or their guns, and it was the Warbeasts and creatures they had created through centuries of genetic engineering and brutal training. Lucas had studied everything he could find about these beasts, and they stood 12 feet tall on 4 massive legs, and their bodies were covered in natural armor that could stop plasma fire, and their jaws could crush metal, and their tails had bone blades at the end that could slice through almost anything, and they had 6 eyes that could see in multiple directions at once, and they were fast, despite their size, and they were smart, and they were absolutely deadly. This particular Warbeast was called Vexthor, and it had killed 17 beings from different alien species, and 3 of those deaths had happened during a peace talk on another planet, and the Krethians had said those deaths were accidents and that the victims had not followed proper safety rules around a warbeast, and the Galactic Council had complained. But no one could do anything, because the Krethians were too powerful and too important. And so Vexthor continued to live and continued to accompany Krethian diplomats as a symbol of their strength. Why would they bring such a thing to a peace negotiation? And Katie asked, and Lucas turned back to the window and watched as the Krethian warship began its approach, and the ship was enormous and dark and covered in weapons, and it moved slowly and carefully toward the docking bay. They want us to be afraid, and Lucas said quietly, and they want us to understand that humans are new to space and that we have only been traveling among the stars for 200 years, and that we are small and weak compared to them, and the Warbeast is a message, and it tells us that they can destroy us whenever they want. Katie stood beside him and watched the ship dock, and the docking clamps locked into place with a sound they could hear, even through the thick walls, and then the airlock doors began to open, and Lucas saw the Krethian delegation begin to emerge, and there were 12 of them. And they wore ceremonial robes that showed their ranks, and their scales gleamed under the station lights, and they moved with a grace that seemed strange for such large beings. And then he saw Vexthor and the Warbeast came through the airlock, and even from this distance Lucas could see how massive it was, and how its 6 eyes scanned everything, and how its tail moved back and forth like a weapon ready to strike, and the creature wore a collar with lights on it, and those were neural inhibitors that were supposed to control the beast. But everyone knew that those collars were mostly for show, and a warbeast that truly wanted to kill could not be stopped by any collar. The beast moved with a terrible grace, and its claws clicked on the metal floor, and 2 Krethian handlers walked beside it, and they carried long rods that could deliver electric shocks, but even they looked nervous, and even they kept their distance from the creature they were supposed to control. "We have 3 days before the negotiations begin," and Katie said, and Lucas nodded, "and 3 days to prepare for the most important diplomatic meeting of his career, and 3 days to figure out how to negotiate with beings who brought a living nightmare to remind humans of their place in the universe." The Krethians wanted access to human farming worlds, and they offered advanced shield technology in return, and on paper it seemed like a fair trade, but Lucas knew this was about more than trade, and this was about testing humanity and seeing how much they could take and seeing if humans would bow to pressure or stand firm. Lucas had been chosen to lead the human delegation because he had experience with difficult negotiations, and he had dealt with hostile alien species before, and he was calm under pressure, and he did not scare easily. But even he felt a chill when he looked at Vexthor, and even he wondered if humanity was ready for this. The station was supposed to be safe, and the diplomatic area was separated from the civilian sections, and there were security forces everywhere. But Lucas knew that safety was an illusion when a warbeast was involved, and these creatures had broken through security before, and they had killed in places that were supposed to be protected, and if Vexthor decided to attack, then many people would die before it could be stopped. Katie was looking at her datapad and reading the latest intelligence reports, and the Krethians have never lost a warbeast to enemy action, and she said, and every attempt to kill one has failed, and plasma weapons barely hurt them, and explosives only make them angry, and the only way to stop a warbeast is to avoid one. Then we will avoid it, and Lucas said, and we will stay far away from that thing, and we will do our jobs and negotiate the best deal we can, and we will show the Krethians that humans are not afraid. But he was afraid, and he would not admit it out loud. But he was afraid, and every human on the station was afraid, because Vexthor was death walking on 4 legs, and it was a reminder that humanity was still small, and still vulnerable, and still learning its place among the stars. The Krethian delegation disappeared into their assigned quarters, and they took Vexthor with them, and the docking bay emptied, and Lucas finally allowed himself to breathe normally again, and he looked at Katie and saw the same relief on her face. 3 days, and he said, and we have 3 days, and then we sit across from them and we try to make peace while that thing watches us. Katie nodded and put away her datapad, and we can do this, and she said, and humans have survived worse, and we have faced worse dangers. But Lucas was not so sure, and he thought about Vexthor and about the 17 beings it had killed, and about the fact that humans had never encountered anything like this before, and humanity had predators on Earth, and humans had dangerous animals. But nothing like a warbeast, and nothing that combined size and strength and intelligence and pure aggression into one perfect killing machine. He turned away from the window and headed back to his quarters, and he had reports to read and strategies to plan and a team to prepare. But his mind kept returning to the image of Vex Thor, and to those 6 eyes, and to that terrible grace, and to the knowledge that somewhere on this station a nightmare was sleeping and waiting.